Raising Harry, Chapter 11. Harry couldn't believe his eyes. Everything was so magical, and new and exciting, he just wanted to see it all. He practically flew to every single window there was to look through, and with each one his smile grew wider and wider. Katrina and Hagrid, especially, had a hard time keeping up with him through the large crowd that always seemed to be there. Katrina always got lost in the crowd due to her being fairly short, and as she dipped, ducked and dodged through people, she saw Harry go into the bookshop. She smiled, and remembered that was the first store she went into as well on her first visit to Diagon Alley. She motioned for Hagrid to follow, and Hagrid said, "I'll just wait out here for ya." Katrina nodded, knowing he'd probably have a hard time getting through the door anyways, and she went in. As she arrived through the door, she saw Harry looking through the books on the shelves curiously, and she suddenly had a flashback to her first visit to the shop, when she met a certain handsome marauder. The 20th of August, 1971. An 11-year-old Katrina Belmont was browsing through the bookshop, searching for the books that were listed on her Hogwarts supply list. She was a slim young girl with somewhat bushy brown hair and sparkling hazel eyes, wearing a pink t-shirt, a pair of bell-bottom jeans, tan flip-flops, a pink headband and silver charm bracelet. She had trouble reaching the potions textbook she needed, and kept jumping up and down trying to reach it, and when she finally grabbed it, she fell to the ground, and the 4 other books she was holding fell all around her. She groaned slightly, and she heard a timid voice ask, "Hey, are you alright?" She looked around to find the voice, and her eyes fell on a skinny boy who was taller than her, and had light brown hair with warm dark brown eyes and a couple of scars on his face. She smiled at him and said, "Oh, yeah, I'm fine, I'm used to it, haha." He smiled slightly, but still seemed a bit timid. She got up and dusted herself off as the boy rushed over and helped her pick up her books, and as he handed them to her, she said thanks. He nodded, and she held out her hand, and said, "Hi. I'm Katrina Belmont, and you are?" He hesitantly took her hand and shook it as he said, "I'm Remus Lupin." She grinned as she said, "Nice to meet you. Are you going to Hogwarts too?" He nodded, and she said, "I wonder what it's like. I didn't find out that I was a witch until a few days ago actually, when I got my Hogwarts letter." He looked surprised as he asked, "You're Muggleborn?" She looked at him questioningly, and asked, "Muggleborn?" He said with a small smile, "Oh, it means your family doesn't have magic folk in it. Muggles are another word for people who don't have magic." She nodded understandingly as she said, "Oh, well then yes I am, are you?" He shook his head and said, "No, I'm a half-blood, my dad is a wizard, but my mum isn't." She said, "Oh. Well that's neat." They exchanged smiles, and she looked at the clock above the shelves as she said, "Oh fiddlesticks. I promised my parents I'd meet them at the ice cream parlor around here in 5 minutes. I've got to go now, but it was nice to meet you, Remus. I hope to see you on the train." He said, "Nice to meet you too, and yeah, I'll look for you." She grinned at him, and as she quickly carried her books to the register, she smiled to herself for making her first wizard friend. Back to where we left off. Mum?" asked Harry, and Katrina snapped out of her memory, and she smiled as she answered, "Yes, sweetheart." He asked, "Are you okay?" She nodded and she said, "Oh, yes, I'm fine, I was just remembering my first time in this shop. Are you ready to go?" He nodded, and she asked as they left the shop and regrouped with Hagrid, "So, where to next, Harry?" He looked around, and he saw that there was an ice cream parlor next door. He asked, "Can we get ice cream?" She looked thoughtful for a moment, and she said, "How about we grab some lunch first, and then after looking through a couple more shops, we can go to the ice cream place. Sound good?" He grinned and said okay, and they looked to Hagrid, and he said, "Sounds good to me." Katrina grinned as she said, "All right. Let's go to the restaurant over there." About an hour later, once they finished their lunch of a hearty stew, crusty bread and cider, they walked outside and looked around. Harry thought about where he wanted to go next, when suddenly he noticed a girl about his age being dragged by her mother by the arm. When the woman let go, and shoved her inside a shop, Harry caught a glimpse of a bruise on her shoulder where the mother just let go. Harry frowned, and walked into the shop after them, and Katrina said, "Harry, wait," but he didn't listen. He walked inside the shop, searching for the girl and her mother, when he spotted them by the cash register. The girl had tears in her eyes and looked frightened while the mother was talking to the man behind the counter. He looked at the girl, who had long blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, blue eyes and wore a light blue t-shirt, dark jeans and blue sandals. He approached her, and asked, "Are you all right?" She looked startled as she looked at him, but answered, "Yes, I'm okay." Katrina found Harry and said, "There you are. And I see you've made a friend. What's your name, sweetie?" she added with a friendly smile, and the girl answered with a small smile, "I'm Mary." Harry held out his hand and said, "I'm Harry." They shook hands, and smiled at each other, but suddenly the mother turned around and said sternly, "I thought I told you to stay quiet, you little." Katrina looked disapprovingly at the mother, and Mary's mother sniffed as she said, "Come on darling, we have better things to do than chat with mudbloods." Katrina's mouth fell open, and Hagrid, who stood right behind her, said, "Now THA's not very nice, apologize to the lady." Mary's mother turned around and said, "Oh shut up you big oaf." Hagrid said angrily, "Hold on now, ye can't just." But the woman left the shop, dragging Mary behind her, who had an apologetic look on her face as the door closed behind her. Katrina was still in shock, she hadn't been called that since she was in school. Hagrid put his hand on her shoulder as he asked, "You all right? Don't listen to her, she's just..." Katrina smiled softly as she patted Hagrid's hand and took a deep breath as she said, "It's okay Hagrid, I'm fine. I just hope that poor little girl is okay." Harry and Hagrid nodded solemnly, and Katrina said, "Well Harry, I think I could use that ice cream now, how about you?" Harry offered a small smile, and they headed out of the shop door. As they left, Katrina wiped away a tear that had trailed down her cheek, hoping Harry and Hagrid didn't notice, but they did, and frowned at each other. They went into the ice cream parlor, and ate their ice cream quietly, but it was still enjoyable. They headed back to Hagrid's bike and hopped in, and soon once again they were flying through the air, back to Hogwarts. Once they arrived, Katrina hugged Hagrid as she said goodbye, and as he let go of her, he said, "Don't let people like THA women get ya down, now. You're a wonderful person, Katrina, it don't matter if you're a muggle born." Katrina smiled softly as she said, "Thanks, Hagrid. You're the best." Hagrid smiled, and then turned around and shook Harry's hand, which shook his whole arm as he said, "Nice to see you again Harry. Hope I'll be seeing you again soon." Harry grinned and said, "Yeah." Katrina put her arm around Harry as they walked inside the castle. She said, "Harry, I'm so sorry your birthday ended like that. I wanted it to be such an exciting day for you." Harry smiled as he said, "It was, Mum. I didn't like that woman, and I feel bad for Mary, but it's not your fault. I still had a really nice day, thanks." She smiled as she hugged him, and he hugged her back. They continued walking until they met in front of Dumbledore's office, and McGonagall was there waiting. McGonagall smiled as she said, "Ah, there you are. Did you have a nice day?" Katrina smiled as Harry said yeah, and they walked to Hogsmeade together where they all apparated back to McGonagall Mansion. As Katrina went inside, Harry stayed behind with McGonagall for a moment as he asked, "Auntie, what does mudblood mean?" McGonagall looked shocked, and said, "It's a very cruel word, Harry. Where on earth did you hear that?" Harry said quietly, "A woman called Mum that today, and it hurt Mum a lot, so I was wondering what it means." McGonagall calmed a bit as she said, "Oh my, the poor dear. Well Harry, Miss Belmont is a muggle-born, her parents were not magical, and some people frown upon that. They are usually purebloods, or people who are related to a long line of wizards on both their parents' sides. A mudblood is a cruel word for people who are muggle-borns, it means dirty blood." Harry frowned, and said, "That's awful." McGonagall nodded, and said, "Yes, well we'd better get inside before Miss Belmont wonders what happened to us. I believe she baked you a cake for the occasion." Harry grinned as he asked, "Chocolate?" She smiled as she said, "I believe so," and they headed inside, to find Katrina holding a chocolate cake with 10 candles on it, just waiting for Harry to blow them out. Harry grinned as Katrina and McGonagall sang happy birthday to him, and he wished for his mum to never be called a mudblood again. Raising Harry, Chapter 12. 1 year later. Harry awoke on the morning of his 11th birthday with a grin. At the end of the summer, he would be going to Hogwarts. He quickly showered and dressed into a dark green t-shirt, dark blue jeans and brown casual shoes. He adjusted his glasses, and ran his hand through his messy black hair as he ran down the stairs to find Katrina cooking in the kitchen. He said, "Hey Mum." Katrina turned around and smiled warmly as she said, "Happy birthday sweetie. Breakfast will be ready in just a minute." He nodded and asked, do you need any help, and she replied, oh you're sweet, but no thank you. She then said, but you can open your present, I got you a little something. He smiled and looked to the table to find a small, neatly wrapped crimson package. He tore off the wrapping paper gently and opened the box to find a box filled with about 5 boxes of chocolate frogs, a box of Bertie Bott's beans, and 3 pumpkin pasties. He grinned at the candies. This was a tradition of hers to give him a box of his favorite candies for special occasions and holidays. He hugged her from the side as he said, I love it Mum, thanks. She smiled as she replied, you're welcome. Now how does some chocolate chip pancakes with cheesy scrambled eggs and bacon sound? He grinned as he replied, sounds great. And looks even better. She kissed his cheek as she set his plate down in front of him, and got herself a plate too. Once they finished, Katrina asked, so Harry, what would you like to do today? Harry thought for a moment, and he asked, could we get Hagrid to meet us at Diagon Alley? Katrina smiled as she said, I thought you might say that. Okay, let me see what I can do. Harry nodded, and just as they got up from their seats, a grey-spotted owl swooped in through the open kitchen window, and sat on the kitchen table, a letter in its beak. Katrina smiled as she said, I think I know what this is, go on and take it Harry. Harry took the letter gently from the owl's beak, and Katrina got a cookie from the jar on the counter and offered it to the owl, who accepted it gratefully as she stroked its back. Harry opened the letter with slightly trembling fingers, and as he took it out, he read out loud, Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you've been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Katrina now had tears in her eyes as she knew that this was the year he would be going off to school, and she hugged Harry tightly as she said, oh Harry, I can't believe that your time to go to Hogwarts has come already. It seems only yesterday we brought you here. She sniffled and wiped some tears from her eyes as she let go, and he said, oh Mum, she said with a slight laugh, I'm sorry dear, I can't help it, and she blew her nose into a tissue. She then stroked the owl again and asked, can you wait here for a moment? I have a letter for you to take back. It waited patiently as Katrina wrote a quick letter to McGonagall asking if she could ask Hagrid to meet them at Diagon Alley after lunch, and as she handed the letter to the owl, she said, take it to Professor McGonagall, please. It flew off, and she said to Harry, and now we wait, I'm going to change out of my pajamas and then we'll get started on our day here, okay? He nodded with a smile, and she went upstairs to shower. Once she finished, she changed into a yellow tank top, a pair of white capris and white flip-flops, then she put her hair into a braid. As she came down the stairs, Harry was cleaning up the dishes, and Katrina said, oh Harry, you didn't have to do that, especially on your birthday. He said, I know, but I wanted to anyways, with a smile, and she smiled back when the same grey owl flew through the window once again, dropping a letter into her hands. She opened the letter, which read, Miss Belmont. Hagrid said he will meet you in the Leaky Cauldron around noon, and then the 3 of you can help Harry get his supplies for school after lunch. Have a good time, and please tell Harry happy birthday for me. Professor McGonagall. Katrina looked at her watch, and grinned. It was 11:30. Harry, dear. Hagrid will meet us at noon, so we'll get going in a little bit. Harry yelled from the living room, okay. Katrina smiled softly to herself, and found herself remembering when she first found out about Hogwarts, and recalled the day she made one of the best friends she ever had during her time at Hogwarts. The 1st of September, 1971. Young Katrina, dressed in a pink tank top, dark jeans, and pink and white sneakers, had just said goodbye to her family, and was now dragging her trunk across the floor to find an empty compartment. She wiped a few tears from her eyes as she was sad to leave her family, but was also excited. She wondered if she'd see that boy Remus she ran into at the bookshop, but suddenly her thoughts were interrupted as she collided with another student, causing them both to fall backwards with an oomph. Katrina winced in pain as her back hit her own trunk, and apparently the other person suffered a similar fate. Katrina said, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? As she stood up, holding out her hand to help the other person up, who said, oh, yes, I'm all right, you. Katrina nodded, and as she let go once the person stood up, they looked at each other, and Katrina asked, is this your first trip to Hogwarts as well? The girl, whose skin tone was slightly darker than hers, had long, dark brown, almost black hair and brown eyes, wore a yellow t-shirt, light jeans and white sneakers, nodded, and said yeah. Katrina nodded and said, nice to meet you. I'm Katrina Belmont, as she held out her hand once again, this time to shake hands. The girl smiled and shook her hand as she said, I'm Arin Mystic, nice to meet you too. You want to share a compartment? Katrina grinned as she said yeah. They dragged their trunks down the hall, until they reached an empty compartment, and they helped each other fit their trunks on the shelves above. They each wiped their foreheads and sighed in relief once they finished, and collapsed into their seats across from each other. Katrina asked, so, when did you find out you were a witch? Arin replied, the day I got my Hogwarts letter, actually. Katrina said, me too, with a grin, and Arin asked, how did your parents react? Katrina thought for a moment, and said, well, my dad kinda just shrugged and said congrats sweetie, and my mum was like, oh my god, is this real? This can't be real, witches aren't real, are they? Is this a joke? No, it looks real. Oh my. It was too funny. Katrina then started laughing, and Arin laughed with her. Katrina wiped tears from her eyes as she settled down and asked, how about yours? Arin too thought for a moment, and she said, my mom was like, oh, well, this is unexpected, and great. Yeah, great, that's great sweetheart. And my dad was like, nope, that's just junk mail honey, don't worry about it, and when he tried to throw it away, it somehow kept reappearing. His face was priceless when he finally realized that it was real. They then started laughing again, and Katrina said, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and they grinned at each other. Little did they know how that would be true. Back to where we were before. Mum? Harry asked, causing her to snap out of her memory. Home. Katrina said, and she looked at her watch, which read 11:58, and she said, oh. Let's go dear, sorry, and they headed to the door. Katrina said, okay, Harry, we're going to apparate this time, you might feel a little sick afterwards, but it'll go away after a few moments. Got your letter with you? Harry nodded, and she said, okay, now take hold of my arm, and with a pop. They were off to the leaky cauldron. They arrived in front of the leaky cauldron, and Harry looked a bit pale, and Katrina put her hand gently on his cheek and asked, oh, you all right dear? He nodded, and she said, all right, we'll wait out here for a minute so you can get some fresh air to help you feel better. He nodded gratefully, and she said, after lunch we'll go ahead and get all your school supplies, okay, causing him to grin. After a minute, they went inside and immediately saw Hagrid standing at the bar, talking to the bartender, who asked here for a drink. Hagrid, he shook his head, and said nope, got some Hogwarts business to take care of, as he saw Katrina and Harry come in. Katrina hugged Hagrid as she said, Hagrid. How are you? He hugged her back and said, I'm alright, how about yourself? And hello Harry, as Katrina let go and replied, I'm great, and Harry grinned. Hagrid said, I think we'll have a bite to eat before heading to Diagon Alley, though, Tom. The bartender nodded, but noticed the scar on Harry's forehead, and said, bless my soul. It's Harry Potter. At that moment, the whole restaurant froze with an eerie silence, but then suddenly bustled with energy as all the people came forward to shake his hand and look at the boy who lived. Katrina was shoved out of the way, and Hagrid had a hard time standing there as well. Mr. Potter, very pleased to meet you at last. I can't tell you what an honor it is. Oh, this is a treat, as Harry's hand was jerked from person to shake hands, and he tried to smile at all of them, but it was a bit overwhelming. Then there was a pause as a man wearing a purple turban and tan robes came up and said, HHI, PP Potter. Very PP pleased to meet you. Hagrid smiled as he approached Harry and said, Professor Quirrell. Didn't expect to see ya. Harry, he's the defense against the dark arts teacher at Hogwarts. Harry smiled and said, oh, well, pleased to meet you, Professor. Quirrell didn't want to shake anyone's hand, but said, not that you need it, PP Potter, with a shaky laugh, and Harry looked slightly confused, but nodded. Hagrid said, well, we'd best be off, and they found Katrina sitting at a table not too far away. After a nice lunch of pot roast and crusty bread, they were ready to go shopping in Diagon Alley. They went to the brick wall once again, and Hagrid used his pink umbrella to tap the combination, letting them inside. Harry was still amazed at the scenery, and the bustling streets and colorful shops, and Katrina asked, so, where should we go first, dear? Harry thought for a moment, and then said, well, the letter says I need a wand, robes, a cauldron, dragon hide gloves, books, and an owl is optional. Katrina laughed as she noticed his confused expression, and said, I know it sounds weird, but yes, we do need to get you all these things, but oh, First, we should go to Gringotts, that's where all your money is kept. Harry asked. I have money. Hagrid chuckled as he said, ye don't think your parents didn't leave ye anything for ya, do ya? And they headed towards the bank. Katrina said before they entered, now Harry, the people, I mean, magical beings, that run this place are goblins, which aren't always the nicest of people, but they ensure the safety of your money. Harry gulped slightly, but nodded, and Hagrid added, no safer place, except maybe Hogwarts, and they went inside. Once Harry got to his vault and took out some of his money, which he was very surprised to see, and Hagrid visited a vault, taking a very strange small package out of it. They left, and Katrina suggested that Harry should get his robes from Madame Mackin's. Katrina took Harry inside, and waited as Harry was fitted into his Hogwarts robes, and once Madame Mackin finished and they purchased the robes and outfits, they were off. Soon they got the cauldron, books and gloves, and their last stop was at Ollivander's, and Katrina went with Harry as Hagrid said, I'll be right back, there's something I've got to do first. Katrina nodded, and the two went inside. Katrina called out Mr. Ollivander, who appeared from behind a row of boxes, and said, why, Miss Belmont. How good to see you, dear girl. Let's see now, is your wand still good? 5½ inches with a unicorn tail core, I recall. Katrina smiled and replied, it's still in good condition, and you recall correctly. It's now Harry's turn to get a wand though. Mr. Ollivander said, I wondered when I'd be seeing you in my shop, Mr. Potter, let us see what wand fits you. The wand does choose the wizard, you know. Katrina nodded for him to follow Mr. Ollivander, who pulled a box from the shelf, and said, now, go on and give it a wave, and Harry did, causing all the wand boxes in one row to fly off the shelves. Katrina winced, and Mr. Ollivander said, nope, perhaps not that one. Try this one, as he handed Harry another one, but when Harry waved this one, a vase with a flower in it shattered to pieces, and Mr. Ollivander said, nope, not that one either. Tricky. But not to worry, we will find one for you. He was quiet for a moment as he said, I wonder. As he handed Harry another wand, and when Harry held it, it suddenly became windy around Harry, causing his hair to be tousled, revealing his scar. Katrina's eyes widened, and Mr. Ollivander said, curious, very curious. Harry looked to him questioningly as he asked, sorry, but what's curious, sir? Mr. Ollivander said, it's curious that this wand should be yours, because the phoenix whose feather is the heart of your wand only gave one other feather, and that feather remains in the wand that gave you that very scar. Katrina looked startled, and put her hands on Harry's shoulders behind him, as Mr. Ollivander said, oh yes, he did terrible things, but great. I believe we can expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. Once they bought their wand and were on their way out, Hagrid knocked on the window, holding a gold cage with a snowy white owl in it, and Harry grinned, as did Katrina. As they went outside, Katrina said, so that's where you went off to? Oh Hagrid, how sweet of you. Hagrid smiled and said, happy birthday, Harry. Oh, and I've got something else for ya. Might have sat on it by accident, but it'll taste all right, I hope. I made it myself, as he handed Harry a slightly squashed box, and Harry opened it, and saw a chocolate cake with Happy Birthday Harry, written messily in green icing. Harry grinned and said, thanks, Hagrid. Katrina smiled warmly, and said, Hagrid, you dear man. Hagrid smiled and said, it was no trouble at all. Well, I've got to get back, but it was good to see ye both. I'll see ya at Hogwarts, Harry. Katrina hugged Hagrid once again, saying it was wonderful to see you. I will try and visit for tea, too. Hagrid said, please do. I don't see enough of ye anymore. And he headed off for Hogwarts, and Katrina asked, so, you ready to go back home? Harry nodded, and they apparated back to McGonagall Mansion. The rest of the day, they relaxed and had a slice or two of Hagrid's chocolate cake while talking about Hogwarts, and when McGonagall got home, she surprised Harry with a new trunk for all his school supplies. Harry was now more excited than ever to get to Hogwarts and experience the magic. Raising Harry, Chapter 13. A month and a day later. Today was the day. Harry was going to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Katrina woke up feeling excited for him and said all at once, she knew Harry would have a wonderful time at Hogwarts, but she would miss him so. She knew it would be good for them, but at the same time she knew she was going to miss seeing his smiling face every day until the next summer. She felt as if she wanted to cry, but took a deep breath as she got out of bed, and looked at the clock. It was 9 o'clock, she had to hurry since the train leaves at 11 precisely. McGonagall was already at the school. The first day back was always busy, especially since she was the deputy headmistress. Katrina quickly got out of bed, startling her cat as she ran into the bathroom and showered. She picked out a red floral dress that flowed down to her knees, and white sandals to go with it. She decided to put her hair partially up, and put her favorite little silver necklace on before putting on a little makeup and heading down the stairs quickly to start breakfast. She would have woken Harry up, but she wanted him to get as much sleep as possible for his exciting day. She made cheesy scrambled eggs on toast, making sandwiches, and a nice fruit salad to go with it. Soon enough she heard someone bounding down the stairs, wearing a dark blue polo shirt with light blue jeans and white sneakers, his emerald eyes shining with excitement behind his round glasses. "Morning, Mum," Harry said with a grin, and Katrina replied, "Morning, dear. Today's the big day. You excited?" He nodded with a smile, but looked also a bit nervous, which Katrina noticed as she handed him his plate of breakfast. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she asked, and he sighed as he said, "What if I don't make any friends? What if I'm the worst wizard at Hogwarts?" Katrina sat down across from him and put her hand on his as she said, "Oh honey, I had exactly the same fears at your age, but you know what? You will make friends, and you will be a fantastic wizard. And you know why?" He shook his head no, and she continued with a smile, "Because you have your parents' blood flowing in your veins, and they are watching over you." She had tears in her eyes, and she went over and hugged him tightly, and said, "And you have me, too, Harry." He mumbled into her shoulder, "I know, Mum." She wiped tears from her eyes, and said, "All right, now, let's hurry and eat. We have to be at King's Cross by 10:40 at least." Harry nodded with a small smile as they ate quickly, and once they finished, Katrina put their plates in the sink, and she rushed upstairs with him to help him make sure that he had everything packed. "Okay, so you've got your robes and all your clothes packed?" she asked, and Harry nodded. She asked, "All your books, your cauldron, and your wand?" He nodded, and she asked, "Your toiletries, including your toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo, comb?" Harry interrupted, saying "Muum," in a slightly embarrassed tone. She laughed and said, Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure." "Okay, let's go, I'll take your owl, and then we can carry your trunk down the stairs together." He nodded, and she asked, "By the way, what did you decide to name her?" "She's beautiful." Harry said, "I saw the name Hedwig in a book, so I think I'll call her that." She nodded, and said, "It sounds kind of regal, I like it," with a smile. As they carried it all down the stairs, she took a deep breath, and asked, "So, are you ready, dear?" He took a look around, and nodded, and she said, "All right, it's time to go, we'll have to apparate again." Harry nodded, and she said, "All right, hold on to my arm, as well as your trunk." He did as he was asked, and with a pop, they went to King's Cross. They appeared right in front of the King's Cross building, and Katrina asked, "Do you feel okay?" He nodded, but looked somewhat pale. She said, "All right, take a deep breath of fresh air, and we'll wait a minute." She looked at her watch, it read 10:52. "Oh goodness. All right, it's time to get to platform 9¾ He nodded, and they rushed, Hedwig in her cage and his trunk in hand. As they got to the wall between platforms 9 and 10, she said, "Okay, Harry, this is part of the magic, we're going to run through that wall." Harry looked shocked, and she said, "On the count of 3, we'll run into it, 1, 2, 3. And they ran into the wall, and soon found themselves staring at the Hogwarts Express, at which Harry looked amazed. She smiled at the awe in his emerald eyes, and said, "All right, Harry, it's time for you to go. Oh, I'm going to miss you so much." As she hugged him tightly, and he hugged her back, and she said, "I love you, Harry." He replied, "I love you too, Mum," and she kissed his cheek as she let go of him and said, "Hogwarts is waiting," with a smile. He smiled back, and took his trunk and owl onto the train. As soon as he got on the train, tears streamed down her face, her little boy was growing up. As the train started to leave, and the whistle sounded, she saw him appear in a compartment window, and he smiled as he waved to her. She waved back, and blew a few kisses to him as she watched the train carry him farther and farther away. She then blew her nose into a tissue, and the tears still streamed down her face, but then she heard a kindly voice say behind her, "Oh, I know dear, it's always hard, especially for the first one. Katrina turned around, and saw a slightly plump woman with red hair, wearing a tan cardigan over a brown dress. Katrina smiled as she nodded, and the woman said, "My sixth son just left for his first time at Hogwarts too. What's your name, dear?" Katrina dabbed at her eyes, and then held out her hand as she said, "I'm Katrina Belmont, and you are?" She took her hand and said, "I'm Molly Weasley, and this is my youngest, and my only daughter, Ginny." Katrina smiled as she said, "So nice to meet you both, and thank you for your kind words, I really appreciate it." Molly smiled, and asked, "How would you like to come back and have a cup of tea with me at my home? You seem like you could do with some cheering up and a spot of tea." Katrina smiled and said, "That would be lovely actually, thank you so much." Soon she found herself apparating back with Molly and Ginny, and sitting at Molly's kitchen table with a nice pot of tea, and wonderful new friend. On the Hogwarts Express. Harry sighed as he thought, "This is it, I'm going to Hogwarts. I wonder which house I'll be sorted into." His thoughts were interrupted by a pretty young girl with long blonde hair and blue eyes, who wore a white t-shirt with light blue jeans and white and blue sneakers as she poked her head in the compartment. She asked timidly, "Harry?" Harry looked alarmed to see Mary. She smiled, and he said, "Come on in," to which she replied thanks, and she sat down across from him. He asked, "So, how are things?" She looked sad as she looked out the window, and he frowned as he said, "That bad, huh?" She nodded, and said, "But I don't want to talk about it, if that's okay." He said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. So are you excited to go to Hogwarts?" She nodded, and just as she was about to ask him the same question, a red-headed boy poked his head into the compartment as well, and asked, "Would you mind? Everywhere else is full." Harry said sure, and the boy came in and sat down next to Mary, and he said, "Ron Weasley by the way." Harry said, "I'm Harry Potter." Ron and Mary both looked shocked, and Ron asked, "Do you really have that, scar?" Harry nodded, and lifted up his messy hair to reveal the scar, to which Ron replied, "Wicked," as he looked in awe, but then caught himself staring, and asked Mary, "Who are you by the way?" She said shyly, "I'm Mary Black." Ron nodded to her, and then the trolley filled with candies pulled up, and the woman asked, "Anything off the trolley, dears?" Mary and Ron looked tempted, and Harry noticed, so he said, "We'll take 3 pumpkin pasties, 3 chocolate frogs, 3 packs of licorice wands, and 3 boxes of Bertie Bott's, please," as he pulled out the galleons he had left from his trip to Gringotts, and he handed out the candies he bought for each of them. Mary smiled gratefully as she said thank you, and Ron said, "Yeah. Thanks, Harry." Harry smiled as he said, "Anytime." They spent a good amount of the train ride talking and laughing, and after their candies were finished, a bushy-haired brunette in her Hogwarts robes came in and asked, "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville has lost one." They all shook their heads no, and the girl said, "Holy cricket! You're Harry Potter," as she noticed his lightning bolt scar, and he smiled and nodded, and she said, "I'm Hermione Granger, and you two are," as she looked at the other two. Ron replied with his last mouthful of pumpkin pasty, "Ron Weasley, and this is Mary Black." Hermione looked somewhat disgusted at Ron, but offered a small smile to Mary, and said, "Pleasure. You all should put on your robes, I expect we'll be arriving shortly. Oh, and by the way, Ron, you've got dirt on your nose," and she left the compartment, leaving the trio somewhat bewildered. Harry laughed and said, "This is going to be a fun year." Mary and Ron laughed too, and Harry realized that maybe his mum was right, he would make some friends after all. Raising Harry, Chapter 14. By the time the Hogwarts Express had pulled into the station, Harry, Ron and Mary had changed into their Hogwarts robes and got off the train. Harry suddenly heard a familiar voice holler out to the students' first years, "Follow me now, come on. Let's keep on moving." Harry said. Hagrid, who looked down at Harry with a smile, and said, "Good to see ye again, Harry," and Ron and Mary looked up in awe of the half-giant. He said, "All right now, everyone, let's get to the boats and head to the castle, right this way," as he led them to the boats, and instructed 3 children at a time to get into each boat. All the children looked in awe of the castle as they approached it, seeing the lights coming from inside glowing brightly in the night time. The stars shined brightly above them as well, and Harry grinned at his new friends Ron and Mary, who were in the same boat, figuratively and physically. Once they arrived inside, Hagrid led them to the doors of the dining hall, where Professor McGonagall was waiting for them. Harry was about to run to her and hug her, but then remembered their conversation that no one must know that she helped raise him, So he just smiled at her, and she smiled back and winked quickly. She then put on a serious face as all the children gathered around, and Hagrid said, "Here's to first years, Professor." "Thank you, Hagrid," she said, and then continued as he left, "Welcome to Hogwarts, I'm Professor McGonagall." "Trevor." "There you are," a boy shouted as he found his frog at Professor McGonagall's feet, as he ran forward to grab him. Professor McGonagall looked sternly down at the slightly pudgy boy, who retreated into the crowd with a blush from causing so much attention. She continued, and said, "This school will be your home until the next summer, as it will be so for the next 7 years. You will each be sorted into a house. The houses are Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Whichever house you will be sorted into, will become your family. Any victories will win you points towards your house, any rule breaking will lose you points. These points are tallied up at the end of the year, and whichever house earns the most points will win the house cup. You all will enter the dining hall shortly. In the meantime, please wait here, I will be right back." She went inside the doors behind her, and just as she did, a pale-faced, blonde-haired boy with a smug expression on his face stepped out to face Harry. "So it's true, Harry Potter is in our midst this year," he said, and suddenly the group of children started whispering Harry's name. Harry looked slightly uncomfortable, and the boy continued, "I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy." Mary's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She had heard her mum talk about him a few times while she was locked in her room. Ron snorted at the name, and Draco turned to him and said, "Think that's funny, do you? Says the one in hand-me-down robes and bright orange hair, you must be a Weasley." Ron then frowned, earning a glare from Mary. Draco said as 2 other boys came up behind him, "This is Crabbe and Goyle." He then held out his hand, and said, "I can help you pick out the right sort of friends from the wrong sort." Harry looked unfazed at Draco's hand, and as he looked at him in the eye, he said bluntly but confidently, "I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself, thanks." Draco glared coldly at Harry, but just then Professor McGonagall came back, and Draco went back into the crowd, Crabbe and Goyle following him. McGonagall announced, "All right now, it's time for the sorting," as she ushered the students through the large open doors into the dining hall. The students looked in awe once again at the large crowd of older students, as well as the ceiling, which depicted a starry night just like outside. Hermione's voice was heard by Harry, Ron and Mary as she said, "I read about that ceiling in Hogwarts, a history, it's an enchantment." As the lines of first years stopped at the front of the room, Professor McGonagall took her place next to a somewhat tall stool with an old, worn-looking wizard hat. The said hat then gave a speech, much to the surprise of the first years, in a high-pitched voice about Hogwarts and its houses. Once the hat finished, McGonagall announced, "Now, when I call your name, you will come up here, sit on the stool, and I will place the sorting hat on your head. It will announce which house you will be sorted into, and then you may go take a seat at your house table." She read aloud, "Bones, Susan." A small girl came forward nervously, and as she sat on the stool, she jumped as the hat was placed on her head, and shouted almost immediately, "Hufflepuff." McGonagall smiled at the broad grin on the little girl's face as she got off the stool and ran to the house table, where the other Hufflepuffs cheered and clapped as they welcomed her. McGonagall then read once more, "Ball, Crystal," as a girl with light brown hair with streaks of red in it ran up to the stool, and sat down as the hat was placed on her head, and the hat shouted, "Hufflepuff." The girl grinned, and suddenly the streaks of red in her hair became bright pink as she ran to the Hufflepuff table, which once again exploded with cheers. Granger, Hermione, and the brown, bushy-haired girl that Harry, Ron and Mary had encountered on the train looked a little nervous as she murmured to herself, "Just relax." Ron whispered to Harry, "Mental, that one." "I'm telling you." Harry nodded, but didn't necessarily agree, as he was quite nervous himself. Hermione climbed up onto the stool, and the hat said, Plenty of brain I see, you would do splendid in Ravenclaw, but you are brave of heart, so I will put you in." And the hat then shouted, "Gryffindor." The students from the Gryffindor table roared with cheers, and Hermione grinned as she ran to join them. "Black, Mary." Mary suddenly paled even more than she already was, and Harry sent her a reassuring smile as she walked up to the stool and sat down, and the hat was placed on her head. It said so, "Another black, eh? You know most of your family has been in Slytherin, but there have been a few exceptions that have been made in the past. Let's see, how about?" And the hat shouted, "Gryffindor," and the table once again exploded with cheers as Mary ran to the table with a grin. "Malfoy, Draco." Draco strutted over to the stool with pride, and the hat had barely touched his head before shouting out Slytherin, and the Slytherin students cheered as he joined them. Willow, Layla. A girl with long, brown hair and bright green eyes had come forth to sit on the stool, and as the hat was placed on her head, it shouted Hufflepuff. The Hufflepuff table cheered and applauded once again as she ran over, and Crystal and Layla grinned at each other as they had become friends on the train and looked forward to being in the same house. Weasley, Ronald, and suddenly Ron looked pale green as he walked up to the stool nervously, and he jumped as the hat started talking to him once it was placed on his head. Another Weasley, eh? I know just where to put you. And it shouted Gryffindor. Ron sank in relief as he knew he was sorted into the same house as his brothers Percy, Fred and George, who all cheered as their little brother came to join them. Potter, Harry. McGonagall smiled at Harry, and he smiled nervously back at her as he sat on the stool, and the hat said interesting, very interesting, you've got a lot of courage, a lot of heart, and not a bad mind either, you would do well in Slytherin. Harry's heart pounded in his chest, and he mumbled in a chant, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. The hat then said, not Slytherin, eh? You would do well there, but if you're sure, better be. And the hat shouted Gryffindor. Harry grinned as he couldn't wait to join his friends, and the Gryffindor table cheered even louder as they welcomed the boy who lived into their house. Longbottom, Neville. The slightly pudgy boy from the train stepped forward nervously, and pocketed his toad as he sat on the stool, and had shouted Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table once again cheered as Neville smiled and ran over to sit there. Once the rest of the first years were sorted and seated at their corresponding tables, Professor Dumbledore, who wore purple robes, called for everyone's attention as he said, before we begin our magnificent feast, I'd like to give a couple of announcements. First of all students are forbidden from entering the Dark Forest, as it is a very dangerous place. Secondly, Mr. Flick has reminded me to tell you that the third floor is also forbidden, as I'm sure many of you would rather not experience a most painful death. I'd also like to take the time to announce a new teacher here at Hogwarts, Miss Erin Mystic. He looked to her as she stood up at the staff's table right behind him. She was a very pretty young woman with slightly darker skin, medium-length black, darkish brown hair, and was very smartly dressed in a red cardigan, white blouse and a black skirt. She grinned at the students, as well as the rest of the staff, and Dumbledore continued, saying she will be an assistant, as well as a tutor, in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class. She also wanted for me to say that if anyone wishes for help in herbology, Muggle studies, or potions, she would be willing to tutor for those classes as well. She nodded as she sat back down, and as she did so, Dumbledore said, with that being said, let the feast begin with these few words, blubber, boggle, tweak, thank you. Suddenly, all the tables in the dining hall filled with plates of every kind of food you could imagine, roast beef, roast chickens, mashed potatoes, sausages, rolls, salads, bowls of fruit, along with many other types of food magically appeared. Harry and Ron grinned at each other, and dug in. Hermione, Harry, and Mary politely took portions of food, while Ron grabbed a leg of the roast chicken, and began eating it noisily right off the bone. Right as he finished that one and was about to grab another, a ghostly head popped right in front of his hand, and said good evening, and Ron practically leaped from his seat in horror, at which Harry and Mary wanted to laugh. Percy said hello Sir Nicholas, and a boy named Seamus shouted from across the table, I know you. You're nearly headless Nick, the ghost sighed and said gloomily, I prefer Sir Nicholas if you don't mind. Hermione put her fork down gently on her plate as she asked curiously, nearly headless? How can you be nearly? Percy interrupted her, saying trust me, you don't want to know, it isn't a pretty sight, especially during a meal. Hermione looked surprised, but nodded, still wondering what it meant. Seamus was talking to the students surrounding him. Me dad's a muggle, me mum's a witch, a bit of a shocker when he found out, causing them all to chuckle. Harry looked at the staff table, and noticed a man with slightly greasy, straight black hair, pale skin and dark eyes was staring at him, and he felt a shooting pain from the scar on his forehead. He held it for a second, and as it went away, he asked Percy, who's the professor sitting next to Professor Quirrell? Percy replied, oh, that's Professor Snape, he teaches potions. Not the nicest one, he's a bit of a git actually. Everyone knows that he's wanted the Defense Against the Dark Arts position for years, so that probably hasn't helped his mood. Harry nodded, and said thanks. Once everyone finished their meals, Dumbledore said a few more random words before the dinner dishes were cleared away, and replaced with desserts of all kinds. Harry, who barely had enough room for dessert, managed to eat a small slice of his favorite dessert, treacle tart. Once desserts had been eaten, Dumbledore announced, and now it is time for everyone to head to their dormitories. First years, please follow the designated prefects of your house to get to your common rooms, and I bid you all a warm welcome and a restful night's sleep for your first day of classes tomorrow. Soon all the first years followed the prefects to their house common rooms to get settled, and Harry looked in awe of the staircases that seemed to move frequently. Percy announced to the Gryffindor first years, beware of the staircases, they like to change. Once they reached a portrait of a plump woman, the first years were startled when the portrait began to talk and move, and asked password. Percy replied Cabot Draconis. The portrait swung open, and led to a large but cozy room, with crimson sofas scattered around, chestnut tables and chairs, and a large fireplace. Percy announced to where the dormitories for girls and boys were located, and the students all went off to their beds, to find their school trunks, uniforms and supplies all neat and ready next to their beds. Ron fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow on his bed right after changing into his pajamas. Harry changed into his pajamas, but he couldn't sleep just yet. Instead he saw a window that looked out into the night sky, and he sat right down next to it, gazing into the stars as he thought about all that had happened that day. He felt overjoyed that he had some new friends, and was happy with his choice of house, but he did miss his mum, and wondered if she missed him too. He stared out the window a little while longer before finally climbing into his bed, taking off his glasses and setting them on the nightstand as he did so. He soon fell asleep, and little did he know that miles away, Katrina had been thinking about him all day, and her last thought before falling asleep was that she hoped he was happy. Raising Harry, Chapter 15. Katrina awoke the next morning, and after showering and dressing, she did what she usually did, went to Harry's room to check on him. As she headed towards his room, she remembered the events of the day before, and that Harry wasn't there, he was at Hogwarts. She opened the door to his room and walked inside. His bed was made somewhat messily, and she chuckled at the books and socks scattered on the floor. She sniffled as she thought about how she would miss seeing his smiling face and eager-to-learn attitude each day. She picked up his dirty socks and threw them into his laundry hamper, put the books back on his bookshelf, and made his bed up neatly. As she finished, she sat down on the bed and looked around the room, and thought, so this is what it would be like for the next 4 months until the holidays. She felt a tear trickle down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, and thought to herself, now, don't make such a fuss. Harry will be back sooner than you think. Plus you can send him owls, and check with McGonagall to make sure he's alright. Cheer up, Katrina, in the meantime just relax and start thinking about what you will get for Harry for the holidays. She smiled softly to herself, and walked slowly out of his room, closing the door behind her. Once she arrived in the kitchen, she spread some strawberry preserves on a piece of apple bread she had made the other day when she got home from visiting with her new friend Molly, and made herself a cup of English breakfast tea. She took a bite of the bread and sipped her tea as she thought about Harry, Sirius, and Remus. She still firmly believed that Sirius was innocent, and as she went over the whole ordeal in her mind for perhaps the 1000th time over the past 10 years, an owl swooped in through the window. It landed on the table, right in front of her, and she said, well, hello there, as she offered it a piece of her slice of bread, which it gratefully accepted, and she laughed as she opened the letter it had dropped in her hands. It read, Dear Miss Belmont, I wished to inform you of 2 matters. 1. That Harry was sorted into the Gryffindor house. Minerva is very proud, of course, as I'm sure you are as well, especially since James and Lily were also sorted into Gryffindor when they were his age. The other matter I wished to bring to your attention is that a year and a half ago, a new Prime Minister was chosen. He often seeks my counseling and advice. You may either choose to use this information, or not. It is entirely up to you. Albus Dumbledore. Katrina grinned as she read it, at learning of Harry's sorting and at Dumbledore's clever way of saying don't give up on your friend just yet. She put on her pink hooded jacket, and decided that maybe she should pay a visit to this new Prime Minister as she headed out the door. Back at Hogwarts, Harry awoke the next morning, thinking that all that had happened the day before had only been a dream. But as he looked around the room, he realized that it wasn't a dream, it was real. He grinned in anticipation as he grabbed his glasses from his nightstand, and excitedly got out of bed and ran to the bathroom to shower and change into his school robes. Once he finished, he looked over to Ron's bed, and noticed that he was just waking up. He walked over to Ron and asked, "Meet you down at breakfast?" Ron nodded sleepily, and dragged his feet over to the bathroom to get ready for the day as well. Harry went down the changing staircases carefully and went into the dining hall, where he saw Mary and Hermione talking as they ate at the Gryffindor table. He tried to ignore the pointing and whispers of other students as he went to join the girls. He said hello, and Mary and Hermione replied in unison good morning, cheerfully. He fixed himself a plate of bacon, toast and scrambled eggs and a goblet of pumpkin juice, and about 10 minutes later Ron came in and sat down next to Harry. As he fixed himself a plate piled high with bacon and hash brown potatoes, he asked, "Anyone get their schedules yet?" Hermione answered, "After breakfast we are to go ask the heads of our houses for them and hurry to our first class of the day." Ron nodded, and they ate in silence for a few moments before a ghost came whizzing through the hall, dropping textbooks onto the tables, causing the food to splatter everywhere. McGonagall shouted sharply, "Peeves, I'm warning you." The mischief-making ghost said in a semi-high-pitched squeaky voice, "Oh little firsties. What fun I shall have for the next few weeks," and then he floated quickly out. Harry, Ron, Mary and Hermione all looked at each other, both thankful that the textbooks didn't land near them, and scared to think about running into Peeves from now on. They quickly finished their breakfasts and walked up to Professor McGonagall together to get their schedules. Hermione went first, and McGonagall handed it to her, saying, "Here you go, Miss Granger." Hermione smiled, and said thank you, Professor, as she walked back to her seat. Mary and Ron too got their schedules and headed back to their seats. McGonagall handed Harry his schedule, and said in a low voice, "Harry, we're very proud of you, and your parents would have been quite proud that you were sorted into Gryffindor as well." Harry smiled softly, and headed back to his seat. Apparently they all had their classes together, which made them happy as they had seemed to become fast friends. They all quickly headed back to the Gryffindor common room to get their things for their first class, herbology. Back to where we left off with Katrina. Katrina apparated to the Ministry of Magic, and as she reached the Prime Minister's office, she asked the secretary if she could meet with him. She replied, "I'm afraid Mr. Fudge is out with a co-worker at this time." Katrina said, "Well, I can wait I suppose." The secretary nodded, and Katrina sat down on the sofa in the office. About 20 minutes later, Katrina noticed a somewhat large man wearing a blue suit and fedora talking to a man in black robes, with semi-long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She recognized the blonde-haired man, and he apparently recognized her as well. Much to her dismay, he said, "Why, Katrina Belmont. It's been a long time since we left Hogwarts, hasn't it?" She said politely but without a smile, "Hello Lucius Malfoy, yes it has." He asked, "What are you doing here of all places?" with a slight tone of disgust. She answered, "Well frankly, Lucius, it's none of your business, but let's just say I'm here to help out a friend." He said, ignoring her first comment, "I wouldn't happen to know this friend of yours, would I?" She replied, "You probably do, but I would rather not discuss it with you at this time. It's a matter between myself and the Prime Minister, if I may speak with him." She looked to the Prime Minister with pleading hazel eyes, and he said with a slight smile, "Of course, please do come in," as he entered his office. She was about to follow him, but was stopped by Lucius as he said, "This friend of yours wouldn't happen to be Sirius Black, would it?" Her eyes widened, but then turned into a glare at Lucius, and he said with a smug grin, "Well, I'm afraid that Mr. Black will be in Azkaban for many more years to come." She held her glare and he said, "If I were you, I wouldn't waste your time trying to convince the minister to free him. As far as those with power in the ministry are concerned, Sirius Black is quite guilty." Katrina said angrily, "But simply go to hell." She then quickly walked into the minister's office, and took a couple of deep breaths to calm herself. Lucius always managed to get under her skin, but she was not going to give up on her friend. Raising Harry, Chapter 16. Katrina managed to calm herself down, and as she closed the door, and the minister sat down at his desk, he looked concerned as he asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded, and said, "Yes, I'm sorry." He said, No, it's quite all right, dear." "What did you say your name was again?" She replied with a small smile, "I'm Katrina Belmont, sir." She held out her hand, and he got up and shook it, saying I'm Cornelius Fudge. Pleased to meet you, but what is it you are here to see me about? He sat back down in his chair, and motioned for her to sit down in one of the guest chairs. She complied and sat down, and started by saying, well, you see, when I was in school, I had a friend who always there for me right when I needed him. I'm a Muggle-born, which didn't bode well when I was attending school at Hogwarts during a time when you know who was gathering his followers and their families. My friends and I were often bullied because of our non-magical backgrounds, but this friend of mine, as well as his friends, always stood up for us. He has done so much for me, and 10 years ago, he was wrongfully accused of murdering 13 people, including one of his best friends. I decided that day that I would do everything in my power to help him, just as he would do for me. Yes, Sirius Black is my friend. Mr. Fudge looked quite stunned, and was about to talk, but Katrina held her hand up signaling him to pause, and continued briefly, I know what everyone has probably told you about him, especially Mr. Malfoy, but I assure you I know Sirius Black, and he is no killer. He couldn't kill anyone, you must believe me, sir. Tears began to stream down her face as she thought of the last time she visited him 10 years ago. Mr. Fudge looked sympathetic, and handed her a tissue as he said, Miss Belmont, I'm sorry that you had to go through all that, and Mr. Black may have been a good friend. But I'm sorry, I find it hard to believe that he didn't kill those people. You see, I was there on the scene right after it happened. Her tear-filled hazel eyes widened, and he nodded solemnly as he said, oh yes, I was there. Mr. Black was laughing maniacally as the 12 Muggles lay dead, and a pile of ash and a lone finger that was left of Mr. Pettigrew. Katrina replied, I read what happened, sir, but there has to be another explanation. What if he was framed? What if someone else betrayed the Potters? Sirius was hysterical like that because his closest friends just died that night, and then he watched another one of his friends die too, along with 12 innocent people. That's enough to make anyone become insane for Merlin's sake. Mr. Fudge said, stuttering slightly, I know you wish to help your friend Miss Belmont, and it's very touching, but I'm sorry. There is no evidence, she interrupted, saying in a slightly angry tone, I'm sorry sir, but evidence be damned. Poor Sirius has been rotting in that cold, dark, soulless place for far too long. I refuse to give up on him just because of a lack of evidence. That's exactly what the last minister told me as well. She calmed down a bit, and said, I can see you care more than the last minister did, but clearly not enough to help me. She sighed as she looked to him, who seemed to be at a loss for words. She finished quietly, feeling and sounding defeated, I suppose I've wasted my time here, I'm sorry to bother you, sir. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to see me. As she headed out the door, she closed it behind her, and wiped tears away furiously as she passed by the secretary's desk to apparate home. As she walked in the door, she felt frustrated and sad all at once. She felt as if she had failed her friend. She wanted to visit him at Azkaban several times over the years, but McGonagall wouldn't allow it after she saw the effect it had on her after the first, and apparently last, time. She felt like curling up under the blankets of her bed to cry, but decided to bake something instead. Baking always made her feel happier, and it kept her mind off of things when times became stressful. She decided on baking some of Harry's favorite chocolate chip scones. She might even send him a box with an owl later that day. She had a small smile as she began making the batter, and as she had just put her first batch in the oven when an owl once again swooped in through her window with a letter in its beak. She washed her hands quickly and then retrieved the letter from the owl, petting it as she did so. The letter read, Miss Belmont. Do not feel your words said to Mr. Fudge were wasted, on the contrary, they seemed to affect him deeply. He sent me an owl only a few moments ago, I take it shortly after you left, asking for my advice on the matter. I cannot tell you what I said in case this letter should fall into the wrong hands, but I will say that he is greatly considering looking into your friend's case. I would advise you not to get your hopes up too high, but I do wish that it helps you to raise your spirits. Also, I might add that Harry seems to have made a few friends on his first day, which I'm sure you're happy to hear. Good day. Albus Dumbledore. Katrina smiled at the letter, thinking about Harry's worries that he wouldn't make any friends, and sure enough, he did. She said thank you to the owl, and it left through the window. She thought about what Dumbledore had said in his letter, and smiled. He did give her some hope, and maybe, just maybe, she would finally be able to free her friend. Back at Hogwarts, Harry, Ron, Mary and Hermione were famished by the time lunchtime had rolled around. It had been an exhausting morning. Their first class of the day, herbology, was taught by a short, earthy-looking woman with grey curls and brown and green robes named Professor Sprout. She was nice enough, if perhaps a little curmudgeon-like, and Hermione, being quite the bookworm, managed to earn Gryffindor 20 points as the professor asked a handful of questions. That class wasn't too bad, but the class after that certainly was. Double potions. Potions was taught by a man with a crooked nose, slightly long, greasy hair and black eyes who wore black robes, and Harry recognized him immediately. It was Professor Snape, the man he had asked Percy Weasley about. Ron gulped at the professor's mean appearance, and Hermione and Mary looked slightly intimidated as well. Snape began taking the roll call, and when he called out Harry's name, he glared at the boy. He immediately put him on the spot, asking him questions that Harry remembered reading about, but he couldn't bring himself to answer them, and replied, "I don't know, sir." Snape sneered at him, and snapped at Hermione for holding her hand up in the air from the moment he started asking Harry questions, and Ron managed to choke out B, but Hermione knows the answers. Snape immediately set his black eyes on the red-headed boy, whose ears turned red. The professor then said 5 points will be taken from Gryffindor, for that unnecessary comment from Mr. Weasley. The Slytherin students snickered, and Harry, Ron, Hermione and Mary looked at each other sadly. The quartet couldn't wait to get out of there, and they headed to their last class before lunch, charms. Professor Flitwick was a slightly adorable little wizard, with white hair and beard, half-moon spectacles much like Professor Dumbledore's, and wore dark blue robes. He was rather small, and had to stand on a pile of books to be seen by all the students as they sat at their desks. He was quite witty, and when he took the roll call and arrived at Harry's name, he fell off of his stack of books with a slight squeak of excitement. The students all chuckled, and Hermione and Mary helped the professor up, and helped him pile his stack of books back up, earning them 5 points each to Gryffindor for their kindness. The class was casual and went smoothly, and once class was finished, they all went to lunch. The quartet scarfed down their lunches of tomato soup with grilled cheese sandwiches and goblets of pumpkin juice. Hermione said quietly, "Thanks for sticking up for me to Snape earlier, Ron." Ron's ears turned bright pink as he replied, "No problem." Harry, who was trying to break the awkward silence after that, said, "So, what classes do we have next?" Mary replied, "Next we have a free period, actually. So classes are over for today." Harry, Ron and Hermione sighed in relief, and Harry grinned as he said thanks. She smiled at him, and when her blue eyes met his emerald ones, they stared for a moment, but then looked away from each other, blushing slightly. Hermione said, "Well, I'm going to use this time wisely and work on my homework. You three should probably do the same." Ron groaned, and Mary and Harry nodded in agreement. A couple of tables over, Crystal Ball and Layla Willow had just finished their lunches and had a free period as well. Crystal asked Layla, "Is that really Harry Potter over there?" Layla nodded, causing Crystal to grin, and her long brown hair turned pink with joy as she said, "Bloody hell, that's awesome." Layla grinned, and said, "I know." The two friends had just gotten up from the table to go to the Hufflepuff common room, and as they were leaving, Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle had entered the dining hall, knocking over Crystal on purpose. Layla helped her friend up, and shouted at Malfoy, saying, "Hey! You can't just knock over my friend like that." Layla's green eyes flashed angrily at him, and he came over to her, slightly towering over her, and said with a smirk, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" Layla said angrily and somewhat adorably, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'll tell you what I'm going to do," as she listed off somewhat harmless threats, including ripping up his homework for all his classes and figuring out a curse to make his hair permanently purple. As she was going off, however, Crystal's hair turned an angry shade of red-orange, and she made an angry face with red eyes and razor-sharp teeth behind Layla. As she did so, she mouthed to them, "Leave or you will be in pain." Malfoy and his lackeys started to pale, and ran off before Crystal could make her face even scarier and carry out her silent threat. Crystal quickly changed her face back into its normal appearance just before Layla turned around, saying, "No one messes with my friend. I sure showed them, huh?" Crystal smiled and said they couldn't get away fast enough. "But you may want to work on your threatening skills," as they headed back to their common room. Harry was working on his homework quietly, while Ron was passed out in his textbook across the table, while Hermione and Mary had went to the library to study. Harry was just finishing his potions essay when suddenly a large brown owl swooped in and dropped a parcel in his hands. Harry said thanks, and patted the owl's head, and he opened the box to find a plate full of his favorite snack, his mum's homemade chocolate chip scones. He grinned, and read the note that was laid gently on top. Dear Harry, I hope you're having a good first day at Hogwarts. I miss you so much already. But I wanted to send you some of these as I know they're your favorite. Please owl me and let me know all about your day. Love always. Mum. Harry smiled softly, and ate one of the scones almost immediately before closing the box back up. He immediately took out a piece of parchment and began writing a reply to his mum's note, and after he finished and asked a professor to point him in the direction of the owlery, he decided that it had been a good day after all. Raising Harry, Chapter 17. In Azkaban. Sirius, now bone-thin, extremely pale, and in much need of a shave, as well as a haircut. His skin and hair also looked quite dingy, as he hadn't taken a bath for many years. He was unsure of how long it had been since he first arrived at the soul-sucking prison, but he had been beyond caring for most of it. He had grown used to the Dementors sucking away every single happy thought that came to mind, and falling asleep, if you could call it that, to the sounds of people muttering nonsense to themselves or crying. His heart felt heavy as he thought about James and Lily, and fought with the thoughts every day that he could have done something to save them. He then thought about the last time he had seen his friends. Remus, who he suspected of informing Voldemort, but he was wrong, it was Peter. He knew it the moment he checked Peter's hideout that Halloween night 10 years ago, and when he confronted him, Peter denied it of course. He tried to pin it on Sirius, but before Sirius could kill him, Peter had caused an explosion among the Muggles, and left everyone to believe that he, as well as the Muggles, had been killed by Sirius. Sirius, who wished that he could have been sane enough to explain what happened, was thrown into Azkaban. Once the insanity passed, he was left a shell of his former self, scared, alone and incredibly sad. Later that day, however, he felt a moment of relief at the sight of Katrina. She comforted him when he needed it most, and that had helped to get him through his years of imprisonment. He snapped out of his thoughts when suddenly a human figure opened the door to his cell, and came in saying, "Well, Mr. Black, I'd say it's nice to meet you, but the circumstances being what they are." Sirius looked questioningly at the man, who said Cornelius Fudge, the new Prime Minister. Sirius nodded, and asked in a hoarse, due to lack of nourishment, but polite tone, "What can I do for you, sir?" The minister, who seemed surprised by the politeness of Sirius's voice, said, "Well, normally I wouldn't come and visit prisoners, but a certain subject was brought to my attention recently." Sirius's silvery grey eyes shined slightly with hope, which brightened his sullen face, as the minister continued, "A friend of yours pointed out to me that we hadn't properly investigated your case. Now I'm not saying that I'm convinced that you're innocent, but we're going to look into it a little deeper. For that to happen I need to hear the whole story from you." Sirius's eyes widened as he said, "Well, it's a long story, and you probably won't even believe me." The minister said, "You have my word that I won't leave out any possibilities, regardless if I believe you or not." Sirius nodded hesitantly, and sighed as he began from the point when James and Lily asked him to be their secret keeper, and finished when he found out Peter had betrayed them. The minister listened intently, but said not a word. Once Sirius had finished, the minister looked shocked. Neither of them spoke for a minute, but when the minister made ready to leave, said, "You know, until your friend came into my office a month and a half ago, I hadn't thought about the possibility that the Ministry of Magic had imprisoned someone who was indeed innocent. Now I'm not so sure that was the right choice to make such a rash decision. You've got a good friend on your side, you know." Sirius's eyes held more hope than before as he asked, "Who brought it to your attention, sir?" The minister, who looked hesitant for a moment, but said, "A young lady, Katrina Belmont, I believe. She was very insistent upon seeing me." Sirius smiled softly as he thought, "Oh, Katrina." The minister added, "Yes, sweet girl, she said that you were always a good friend to her. She apparently pestered the last minister quite a bit about your case. I visited him a week ago to ask him about it, and he said she was a stupid girl to believe such nonsense that you might be innocent. It's a shame some people are often so closed-minded." Sirius's eyes filled with tears, and the minister looked surprised as he watched the man struggle to regain his composure. He felt sorry for Sirius, even if he wasn't completely convinced with his story. The minister said before he left, "Well, Mr. Black, thank you for telling me your story. I may not believe you just yet, but I will certainly look into your case." Sirius nodded, and the minister left, leaving Sirius unsure of what to feel. For a long time he battled with his feelings that he was guilty of what happened to his best friends, and he still believed he was, but now he had a little hope, which offered a new perspective. He smiled slightly at the thought of his friend standing up for him so much, even going as far as to pester the last minister, and convincing the new one to take a second look. Even though he had a little hope of getting out of Azkaban by the minister's words, he knew it would still be a long time before anything would be done for his case. Suddenly a thought struck him: what if I could escape this afternoon? He thought about the pros and cons. He could stay put and wait and see what happens with this minister, who seemed to care more than the previous one did. However, his soul would continue to wither away with each passing day until he could get a trial, which would still be quite far off. If he were to run away, he would be on the run for the rest of his life, but he could still be free and perhaps even somehow happy. After an hour of pacing and thinking, he made a decision: he would indeed escape from this horrid place this afternoon, when the Dementors came to pay their daily visit to his cell. 30 minutes later. There was a shaggy, greasy black dog swimming across the sea, away from the Azkaban prison. This dog was indeed Sirius Black. There was an uproar and alarm going on in the Azkaban prison as he swam, but he knew the Dementors couldn't find him in his Animagi form. Approximately 2 hours later, Sirius had finally reached land, and was so exhausted that he remained in his dog form and curled up in a cave not far away. For the first time in a long time, he was able to breathe clean, cool air without fear or sadness. It felt so good to be free it could hardly be put into words. About a week later, Katrina had just arrived back home, groceries in hand, unaware of a black dog following her. As she went inside the house and put the groceries down gently on the counter, she sighed as she got ready to fix dinner for that night. Suddenly, she heard a soft knock on the door. She wondered who could that be, as she went to answer the door, and who she saw she almost didn't recognize. She gasped as it dawned on her, and she asked Sirius. He seemed to have trouble standing up straight as he smiled softly and said, "Katrina, but he was interrupted as he was hugged tightly by her. The wind was knocked out of him, but he returned the hug, and as she stepped back, she yanked him inside after making sure no one saw him. He saw she had tears streaming down her cheeks, but she wiped them away furiously as she asked, "How did you?" As he was about to answer, however, he looked as if he might pass out. She gasped and said, "Oh Sirius. Are you all right?" He barely nodded, and she said, "It's okay, we can talk later, you need some good rest for now. Come on, I'll help you get to a room, and once you wake up I'll have a meal cooked up for you, okay? I'll leave some towels in your room so you can take a bath later too." He couldn't even speak, he was so lightheaded, and she held on to him as she guided him to his room, and helped him lay down on his bed. He was sacked out the instant his head landed on the pillow, and she quietly crept in and out of his room as she scrounged up some clothes and fresh towels for him, and laid them out on a chair near the bed. She then left him to sleep as she hurried down the stairs to start dinner. Somehow she didn't think that the minister had released him from Azkaban, but she was glad he was safe now. She hoped the ministry wouldn't find her, or especially Sirius. He can't go back to that awful place. She shook her head of her worried thoughts, and focused instead on what Harry might be doing, and fixing up some pot roast for dinner. Raising Harry, Chapter 18. Sirius had been asleep for almost a whole day now, and Katrina hoped he would wake up soon to eat, as she knew he had been malnourished for quite some time. She also knew it must have been an incredibly traumatic experience for him in Azkaban, and thought the poor dear. She sat by his bedside for most of the time he was asleep, for she didn't want him to feel alone when he awoke. She had just been reading a book, when suddenly Sirius shouted, "No! James! Lily," and awoke in a cold sweat. Katrina was so startled she dropped the book she was holding and ran to sit with Sirius on the bed, and said, "Shush Sirius, it's okay," as she hugged him tightly. He was shaking, and he sobbed into her shoulder as he said in a barely audible tone, "It's all my fault." Katrina frowned, and as she pulled back gently, she took his hands in hers as she said, "Sirius, it's not your fault at all. You did everything you could. He shook his head, and whimpered, not enough, they are gone. She said quietly, look at me, Sirius. He slowly did as she asked, and she said, you are not at fault in this. James and Lily would not want this, you beating yourself up every single day because of what happened. You must be strong, for yourself as well as for their memory. He didn't know what to say, so he pulled her into a hug, and she hugged him back. The hug lasted for a few moments, and when he pulled back, she said, now you need to wash up and then eat. I left you some clothes and towels on the chair over there, so once you're done come on down the stairs for some lunch, okay? He nodded, and she got up from the bed, and left with a small smile as she went to prepare some lunch. He got up and headed to the shower in the bathroom, taking the towels and clean clothes with him. Once he finished showering and dressing, he went down to the kitchen. Katrina saw out of the corner of her eye when he entered the kitchen, and she put the stirring spoon down on the counter as she went to him, and asked, do you feel a little better? He nodded numbly, and she ushered for him to sit down, and she sat down next to him. She held his hand, and just as she was about to talk to him, he said, I escaped, Katrina. She nodded, and said with a slight smirk, oh yes, I thought that might have been a possibility. He nodded with a small smirk of his own, and said, the minister visited me shortly before I left, and he actually wanted to hear my view on what happened that night. She had a small smile, and he said he told me you got him to take a second look, and you even went as far as to nag the last Prime Minister about my case. She chuckled, and said I did make a bit of a busybody of myself. He had a stick up his ass for sure. He chuckled slightly, and asked why go through all that trouble for me. You didn't have to. She smiled softly, and interrupted him by saying, well, you didn't think I was just going to sit back and let you rot in that horrid place, did you? You've always been there for me, it was my turn to be there for you. He squeezed her hand, adoration clear in his eyes, and she said, I'm just sorry I couldn't help more, and that I couldn't visit you in Azkaban. Professor McGonagall forbade me from going back after. Sirius interrupted, saying, Professor McGonagall. Katrina's eyes widened as she thought about what she had just said, and quickly replied, nothing. Sirius didn't believe her, and asked as she got up to put some stew into a bowl, it's not nothing, how does Professor McGonagall fit into all this? Katrina placed a bowl of stew in front of him, and said sadly, please, Sirius. I'm sorry. I can't tell you. I was sworn to secrecy by her, as well as Professor Dumbledore. Sirius asked, is something wrong? Is it your family? Katrina looked slightly hurt as she sat down with her bowl of stew, which she suddenly lost an appetite for, and replied, no, my family is fine. Sirius said hesitantly, you don't sound like they're fine. Katrina's hazel eyes filled with tears as she sighed and said, when I read about all the Muggle families getting attacked in the Daily Prophet day after day, I was extremely worried about my family. So I decided to protect them, I erased their memories of me, and sent them to America. She said softly, excuse me, I'm sorry, as she ran to her room and locked the door. Sirius looked shocked, and dashed after her, and knocked on the door softly, saying, Katrina. He put his ear to the door, and what he heard made his heart sink. He heard muffled heart-wrenching sobs. He frowned, and sat down at her door, suddenly not feeling very hungry either. About 2 hours later. Katrina had stopped crying about an hour ago. The pain of what happened hadn't really hit her until now, as she hadn't had the time to really process it since a short while later she took Harry in. She smiled softly as she thought of her little boy, even if he wasn't really her son, it felt like he was. She felt awful that she couldn't tell Sirius about his godson, but she had been sworn to secrecy. She hoped that one day she could tell him all about Harry, and that Harry would get to know his godfather, but now wasn't the right time. Sirius shouldn't be running for his life while getting to know his godson. She thought, oh. Sirius. I hope he's okay, I didn't mean to rush off like that. As she opened the door, she saw him quickly get up. He saw her slim figure open the door, and noticed her slightly pink, tear-stained face. He shot her a concerned look as she looked at him questioningly and asked, were you sitting at my door the entire time I was in there? He looked slightly sheepish as he said, well, when you rushed off like that. But he was interrupted by a hug, and he smiled softly as he returned her hug, and as she pulled away, he asked quietly, you okay? She nodded with a small smile, and said, yeah, I'm sorry I rushed off like that. He said, no, I'm sorry for bringing the whole thing up, I shouldn't have pressured you to tell me about it. She said it's okay, that's not the secret I can't tell you. I don't want to get into it again, but I promise that you will find out when the time is right, okay? Professors Dumbledore and McGonagall have done so much for me already, I can't betray their trust on this. Her hazel eyes looked pleadingly into his silvery grey ones, and he said with a slight chuckle, all right, I'll leave it be for now. She let out a sigh of relief as she said thank you. Now did you eat your lunch? He shook his head, and she gasped as she said Sirius. You've gotta eat something, you're only skin and bones. Come on, I'll reheat the stew and give you some bread to go with it. She dragged him to the kitchen and he chuckled as she did so. They ate their now dinner happily, and once they were finished, she made and poured them each a cup of herbal tea and put out a plate of cranberry oatmeal cookies. They talked late into the night, and after she cleaned up their dishes, she said, well, I should be getting off to bed. He nodded, and said yeah, I should probably too, as he got up from his seat, and Katrina did as well. She said, you know, I'm glad you found me. I missed you so. You're like the brother I never had. He smiled softly as he said, I'm glad too. You're like the sister I never had. She smiled softly back at him, and kissed his cheek. She said, if you need anything, just let me know, okay? Good night, love, as she headed towards her room. He said good night, love, and headed towards his room as well. After putting her pajamas on and getting into bed, she thought about how she was grateful that McGonagall wasn't staying at the house for the school year, as she didn't want to lie to her about Sirius living there temporarily. She also thought about how tomorrow was Halloween, the night James and Lily were killed. She hoped Sirius didn't remember it, as it would cause him too much pain to think about. She sighed as she tried not to think about her friends, and fell asleep on the thought, tomorrow I'll go to Diagon Alley and buy some candy to send to Harry tomorrow. I hope he's doing alright, I haven't got an owl from him since a few days ago. Sirius tried to sleep, but he couldn't. He thought about how much trouble Katrina would get into for keeping him in her home. He didn't want for her to get into trouble on his account, even though he knew she would do it full-heartedly because she adored him so. He sat up in his bed, and made a hard, hasty decision. He would leave tonight. He searched his room for a notepad and a pen or pencil, and once he found them, he jotted down a note. As he finished, he left the note on the pillow of the bed, and left the room. He crept into her room quietly, and looked at her one last time as he said softly, I'm sorry, but it's the right thing to do. Once he left her room, he left the house, and looked back at it with a small smile. He said thank you, Katrina, as he turned back into his animagi form, and left into the night. Katrina yawned and stretched as she awoke the next morning, and as she pulled on her robe, she made her way to Sirius's room to check on him. She noticed his door was wide open, and as she asked Sirius, she saw his room was empty, and her heart skipped a beat as she asked frantically Sirius, and checked his bathroom and the kitchen. She then went back to his room to check again, but this time she noticed a note on his pillow. She took it gently, and read it at once. Dear Katrina. Words cannot begin to describe my gratitude for you taking me in. I decided to leave, trust me, it's better for both of us this way. I don't want you to get in trouble with the ministry over me. I promise I will try and keep in touch if I can. Love. Snuffles. Her eyes filled with tears, and she laughed at the name Snuffles, but she took it that that was probably the code name he would be using if the ministry started monitoring her mail. She said, oh Sirius, please be safe. As she wiped her eyes, she pulled herself together, and after folding the note up and putting it in her robe pocket, she went to get ready for the day, when she would go to Diagon Alley and buy a box of Bertie Bott's and a pumpkin pasty or two to send to Harry today. Little did she know that there would be some trouble brewing at Hogwarts that very night. Raising Harry, Chapter 19. Harry, Ron, Hermione and Mary had all had a long 2 months of school so far, but at least they had gotten the hang of things at Hogwarts. Harry and Ron had gotten much better about getting to their classes on time. Mary was the first one to have her broom respond to her command on their first broom flying lesson, and Hermione had been the first to successfully cast the Wingardium Leviosa spell, much to Ron's annoyance. Unfortunately, Ron had made some rude comments to fellow Gryffindors Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan, as well as to Harry about Hermione being an insufferable know-it-all, and Hermione heard. Harry and Mary frowned as they watched Hermione run away, and they could hear her begin to cry. Mary glared at Ron as she went to run after Hermione, and Harry too gave Ron a look as Ron said, "What? She is?" "Harry," said Ron, "without Hermione you would have failed most of your homework assignments so far." Dean and Seamus walked away, talking about the Wingardium Leviosa lesson, the very same one that Hermione had succeeded in, about how Seamus's feather had exploded in his face. Ron's ears turned pink as he said, "Oh, well, yeah, but still. Does she have to go on all the time and acting all high and mighty just because she reads a lot? Honestly. She's a nutter." Harry looked slightly peeved as he said, "She's our friend, Ron. You should appreciate people for who they are, not what you wish they could be." Ron looked both angry and guilty all at once, and stormed off, leaving Harry still slightly annoyed that his best friend could say such things. He thought about what he had just said to Ron, and thought of his mum, who was the one who taught him that. He hoped that she was doing well, as he hadn't owled her for a week now. He felt bad that he hadn't told his friends about her at all, as she also told him that no one can know about who had raised him for both of their safety. He hoped they would meet her someday, but little did he know that it could be sooner than he thought. Back at McGonagall Mansion, Katrina grinned to herself as she arrived home from Diagon Alley, carrying a box of Bertie Bott's and a couple of pumpkin pasties. She couldn't wait to see the grin on his face when she came to Hogwarts that night to pay him a surprise visit. She had decided as she walked around Diagon Alley that she would go see Harry herself. She had missed her little boy so much. She missed Sirius already too, as he had just left last night, but she was grateful that she didn't have to explain why she was going, as he wasn't supposed to know that she was Harry's adoptive mum. She hoped Sirius was alright though, and she reminded herself that if she got an owl from Sirius, she would have to send him some cookies or something to make sure he's not starving. Her thoughts returned to Harry, and after she changed into something a little more festive for Halloween, a pair of dark jeans, a black long-sleeved jacket over an orange t-shirt, and black boots, and put her hair into a high ponytail, she was ready. She put the candies for Harry in her pale pink purse, and she fed her cat his dinner before heading out the door and apparating into Hogsmeade. She had left just as dinner had started at Hogwarts. Back at Hogwarts, Harry had just gotten back from tea with Hagrid that afternoon, which had been a habit now. At the end of every month Harry would go to Hagrid's hut for some tea and some advice, just like Katrina used to do. He also got to learn more about his parents and his mum during their school days, which Hagrid was more than happy to talk about. Once he said goodbye to the warm-hearted half-giant, he headed to the feast, which was about to start. The feast looked incredible. It was a wonderful autumn spread, and caramel apples, chocolates and other candies were all along the house tables as well. It looked good, not that Harry could eat much of it. He managed to eat a bit of ham and mashed potatoes and some roasted squash, but he was feeling homesick, and he also was worried about what happened to Mary and Hermione. He hadn't seen them since Ron had talked badly about Hermione earlier, and Ron was still mad at Harry for putting him on the spot like that. Ron was eating a caramel apple as Harry asked Seamus and Dean, "Have either of you seen Hermione or Mary since earlier?" Ron looked up from his apple, seeming to be slightly worried as well, and as the two boys shook their heads, Neville Longbottom chimed in, and said, "I heard that Hermione was in the girls' bathroom all day, crying. Mary has been there all day trying to help." Harry frowned, and looked to Ron, who looked guilty and stopped eating his apple. Just then, Professor Quirrell burst through the doors and said at the top of his lungs, "Troll! Troll in the dungeons!" The room fell completely silent, and the teachers all got up from the teachers' table, and Quirrell said quietly, "Thought you ought to know," before he fainted. The students took a moment to process what he had just said, and a second later there were screams and panicked voices growing louder and louder. Dumbledore's voice somehow managed to get them to be quieter as he said, "Do not panic, we will handle this matter calmly. Students should be escorted to their dormitories by their house prefects quickly, while I as well as the professors at this table go see that this troll is removed safely." Prefects of each house rounded up all the students and led them to their dormitories, while the professors went to go see to the troll. Harry and Ron trailed behind the mob of Gryffindor students that were led by the prefects, including Ron's older brother Percy. Harry then had a scary thought that he voiced to Ron, "Oh no. Hermione and Mary. They don't know about the troll." Ron groaned as he said, "Oh all right, I suppose I owe her an apology anyways." Harry and Ron dashed off, not knowing that the assistant teacher Miss Mystic was following them. She thought these two are going to be troublemakers for the rest of their school years here, aren't they, as she sighed and followed them, being careful not to be seen. Harry and Ron suddenly heard some large footsteps in the hall, and they hid behind a column as they looked around frantically to find the sound. Their eyes finally laid upon a large, ugly-looking creature dragging a makeshift club behind it. Harry's and Ron's eyes widened in horror as it slowly went into a room, and a second later there were screams heard. Harry and Ron nervously approached the door, and heard a voice shout help. They looked to each other in horror as they recognized the voice. It was Mary's. The troll must have gone into the girls' bathroom. Harry and Ron rushed inside without thinking, and just as the door closed behind them, the troll smashed the stalls with its large club, and Harry felt as if his heart leapt into his throat. Ron shouted "Oi! Pea-brain," and began picking up rocks furiously, tossing them at the troll's head while Harry asked Hermione, "Mary, are you both all right?" He was relieved to hear them both groan and answer yes, and he immediately tried to figure out how to get the troll out of there. On an impulse he decided to climb up the troll's back and hold on tightly around its neck, but that didn't work. The troll grabbed him. The troll was about to start beating Harry with its club, when Ron said Wingardium Leviosa, as his wand cast the spell over its club. Hermione and Mary, who had just escaped the rubble, watched as the club was suspended in midair, and Ron grinned as the club dropped. But it didn't knock the troll out like Ron had hoped, instead it only hit the troll's shoulder, causing him to drop Harry. Harry ran to where Ron was standing, but the troll recovered quickly, and was about to grab the boys when suddenly a voice said "Evet Statum." The troll was knocked backwards, his head hitting the wall, causing him to be knocked out. The girls and boys looked to the voice behind them. It was Miss Mystic. She said, "You were lucky I decided to follow you two," as she looked to Harry and Ron, and she immediately rushed over to the girls and asked, "Are you two all right? Do you want to go to Madame Pomfrey to make sure you're not hurt at all?" They shook their heads no, and Hermione was just about to talk, when suddenly a stern voice said, "Harry Potter." Harry winced as he recognized the voice, and turned around as she looked at the lot of them and asked what on earth happened here. Hermione timidly spoke up, and said, "It was my fault, Professor." "Professor McGonagall," said with a beyond shocked expression Miss Granger. Hermione continued, saying, "I remember reading about trolls, and I thought I could stop the troll from running rampant around the school." Mary spoke up and said, "I thought I could help her, so I went with her." Hermione nodded, and said, "I'm sorry, Professor, if Harry, Ron and Miss Mystic hadn't come to help, we'd probably be dead." Professor McGonagall's face softened slightly, but said sternly, "Miss Granger, you were lucky you and Miss Black weren't killed tonight. 5 points will be taken from each of you for your foolishness." Hermione and Mary accepted their punishment, and Professor McGonagall continued, "And as for you, Mr. Potter and Mr. Weasley, you two were just as foolish to go after the girls yourselves, but since you two were only trying to help your friends, I will award 5 points to you both. After all, not many students can take on a full-grown mountain troll. Miss Mystic, thank you for coming to the aid of these students. No doubt without you they would have not lived to tell the tale." Miss Mystic smiled as she said, "Anytime, Professor McGonagall. I will take them back to the Gryffindor common room if you'd like." McGonagall said, "Oh, all right, thank you. I will get the other professors to help me remove this troll while you do that." Miss Mystic nodded, and said, "Follow me, you four," with a small smile. They all trailed behind her as she led them to their common room, and Hermione said, "Thanks, Ron, Harry." Mary nodded, and Harry nudged Ron, knowing that he still had to apologize, and Ron said grudgingly, "Oh, all right, I'm sorry, Hermione." Hermione smiled softly as she said, "It's okay," and they all smiled at each other. This was an adventure they would never forget. As they arrived to the portrait hole, they saw a brunette figure pacing back and forth in front, and as she looked up at Miss Mystic, she looked shocked as she asked Erin. Miss Mystic gasped as she asked Katrina, and the two squealed with joy, and embraced each other. They both had tears streaming down their faces as they pulled away from each other, and Katrina said, "It's been so long. How are you? What are you doing here?" And Erin said, "Let's catch up in a moment, I was told to bring these four back." Katrina interrupted as she saw Harry behind his friends and asked Harry, and Harry's emerald eyes widened as he asked Mum, and she ran to hug him. She hugged him so tightly that he said, "Mum, I can't breathe," and she laughed as she let go and took his face in her hands gently as she said, "I'm sorry, I just missed you so much." Aaron said, hey. What am I, chopped liver? And you can't be his mother, this is. Katrina forgot that she wasn't supposed to reveal that she raised Harry to anyone, and said, oh fiddlesticks. I forgot, as she looked around at the confused faces, and then she recognized Mary's face as she asked Mary. Mary nodded, and smiled softly as Katrina ran to hug her too. Katrina said, oh, dear, I hope you're alright, the last time I saw you it wasn't under the best circumstances, was it? Mary nodded and said, I'm fine, thank you. Katrina smiled and said, good. Aaron asked, sounding exasperated, okay, what in Merlin's beard is going on here, Cat? Katrina chuckled as she said, I'll explain in a moment, Aaron, I promise. Give me a minute to talk to Harry and his friends and then we can talk privately, okay? Aaron nodded, and waited by the stairs as Katrina kneeled down to the kids' level, and said in a cheerful voice, you must be Ron and Hermione, right? Harry's told me so much about you both. Hermione and Ron looked unsure of what to think as they nodded, and Katrina said gently, I know this seems a bit strange, but before I explain, you must promise that this needs to stay between the five of us, okay? It's very important for Harry's safety, as well as mine. Hermione, Ron and Mary all nodded, and Katrina said with a soft smile, I'm Harry's adoptive mother, I raised him after his parents were killed by you-know-who. Hermione and Ron looked surprised, while Mary had already kind of known from the first day they met in Diagon Alley. Katrina added, I came to visit today because I missed Harry so much, but I'm so glad that I finally got to meet you all. You all seem like good friends. They all looked to each other, and smiled as they thought, yeah, I suppose we are. Katrina smiled, and said, well Harry dear, I have to go talk with Miss Mystic now, but next time I will let you know when I will come see you, okay? I also brought you a little something. She pulled out the Bertie Bott's and pumpkin pasties from her purse, and Harry grinned as she handed them to him, and he hugged his mum as he said, thanks, Mum. She smiled as she said, you're welcome, Harry. As she looked to the rest of the group, she said, if I had known that I'd be seeing you three, I would have brought each of you a little something too. Next time I will, I promise. They all smiled, and Mary said, you don't have to, and Katrina said with a smile as she put her hand on Mary's shoulder, I know, but I will anyways. Katrina laughed softly and pulled Mary in for another hug, and then after shaking Ron's and Hermione's hands, she gave Harry one last hug as she said, I'm so glad I got to see you Harry, please tell Hagrid I said hello and I will have tea with him soon. Harry nodded, and said, I love you, Mum. Katrina kissed Harry's cheek as she said, I love you too, dear. With that, Harry ran off with his friends into the Gryffindor common room. She smiled as she watched them go, and Aaron said, well I'd say you have a lot of explaining to do. Katrina laughed as she looked at her friend, stylishly dressed as always in an orange cardigan, white blouse and black pencil skirt with black pumps, and her dark, semi-long hair pulled into a neat ponytail, and replied, and so I shall. She and Aaron linked arms as they headed for Aaron's office to talk privately. Raising Harry, Chapter 20. Once Katrina reached her friend's office, Aaron said as she closed the door behind them, all right, Spill, where in Merlin's beard have you been for all these years? I've been worried bloody sick about you. No letters, no contact at all. Katrina laughed as she said, you'd better sit down for this one Aaron, it's a long story. Aaron did so as she sighed and said, all right all right. Katrina smiled as she said, well the last time we saw each other was at Harry's welcome home party, right? Aaron nodded, and said, wasn't that a lovely day? Too bad Sirius and I didn't have a good snog, that would have made the day even lovelier. Katrina laughed and said, oh Merlin. I've missed you my friend. Aaron smiled back as she said, I've missed you too. So how's your family? Katrina looked pained as she said, well, I had to let them go. Aaron looked confused as she asked, wait, what? Katrina said as she felt as if she wanted to cry, I obliterated their memories of me, and sent them to America. As tears streamed down her face, Aaron handed her a couple of tissues as she reached for Katrina's other hand. I'm so sorry Kat, that must have been the hardest thing for you to do. Katrina wiped away her tears as she said, it was, I miss them so much. She took a deep breath to pull herself together, and continued, saying, but, let's not talk about it anymore for now, I've got loads more to tell you. It stays between us though, right? Aaron said of course with a small smile, and Katrina said with a weary smile, all right, here comes the big part, The night after James and Lily were killed she paused as Erin had a pained look on her face, and Katrina said as she squeezed her hand, I know, I miss them too. Erin nodded, her eyes filled with tears, and Katrina continued, saying Professors Dumbledore and McGonagall showed up at my door with Harry, and McGonagall asked me if I would help her to raise him. Erin looked stunned. Whoa, why you? I mean, you would be a good choice, but why not Sirius or Remus? Katrina said well they weren't sure who to trust since they are convinced one of them told on James and Lily to Voldemort. I'm still surprised they asked me to do it, but I'm glad I did. I loved raising that little boy as she smiled fondly. Erin smiled as she said oh I'm sure you're a great mum. Katrina smiled as she said oh thanks. Erin then asked with a smug grin so, how about you and Remus? Katrina said, sounding slightly embarrassed. Erin, who asked what? You and Remus clearly liked each other. Katrina smiled sadly as she said Dumbledore wanted to keep me raising Harry under wraps, so I couldn't tell any of the guys. Erin said oh, so you haven't seen or heard from any of them? Katrina shook her head, and Erin said I wonder what Sirius is up to these days. Katrina looked surprised as she asked Erin. You haven't heard anything about Sirius, have you? Erin looked concerned as she asked heard what? Is he alright? Katrina asked don't you get the Daily Prophet? Erin shook her head and replied I stopped getting it after Muggle families were getting attacked and I went into hiding for a while with my family. I didn't come back until last year and then Dumbledore asked me to teach this year. Why? Katrina sighed as she said Erin, if you have any emergency chocolate, I would get it out now. Erin pulled out a large chocolate bar, and each of them took a piece of it before Katrina took a deep breath and said Sirius was locked in Azkaban for 10 years. Erin shrieked, saying what? She leapt from her seat and started pacing frantically. What, but why? Those ministry people can kiss my... Katrina got up and put her hands on Erin's shoulders as she said Erin. Calm down. Erin's brown eyes filled with tears once again as she said angrily I won't calm down. How could they? Katrina said Erin, I didn't finish. There's something else you should know. You're going to want to sit down for this. Erin did so quickly, and Katrina sat back down in her seat as she started again. You see, the day I got Harry was the day he was wrongfully imprisoned for murdering 12 Muggles and Peter. Erin was so shocked she was speechless. Katrina continued, saying I visited him that day, I had never seen him so broken. I nagged that bloody minister for years and each time I came back feeling awful I couldn't get him out of that terrible place. Tears streamed down Erin's face as she thought of the man she had loved since their school years together trapped in a cold, dark place like Azkaban. Katrina reached across the desk and squeezed her friend's hand as she said but. Erin's tear-filled eyes suddenly looked hopeful as Katrina continued Sirius escaped. Erin's eyes widened as she said what but, how? No one has ever done that. Then again, knowing Sirius. Katrina smiled softly as she said quietly I don't know, but a week after he escaped, he showed up at my doorstep. Erin looked even more surprised as she asked how did he even find you? Katrina said I honestly don't know, but anyways I kinda took care of him for a day or two, and then one morning I woke up and he was gone. He just left in the middle of the night. I hope he's okay. Erin said he's gonna be in so much trouble when I get my hands on him. He hasn't even sent me a bloody owl to let me know what's happened, that idiot. Katrina laughed, and said and I would pay to see that moment. Erin then glared at Katrina as she said and you? You're still in trouble for not even sending me an owl. Katrina said I'm sorry. I know I should have. Erin said with a smile but you know I can't stay mad at you. Katrina hugged her friend once again, and said as they pulled away so, now you know all about my story, what's been happening with you? How did you get a job here? Erin sighed as she tucked her dark hair behind her ears and said well it was rather infuriating really. Quite boring too, I couldn't even fight in the war. I wanted to be there for Lily, and for James, it's just so unfair. I mean I'm glad my family is safe, but... Katrina interrupted, saying but you wish you could have saved James and Lily as well. Erin nodded, and Katrina said I know, I wish I could have stopped that despicable man as well. Erin continued with a sigh, saying but when I arrived back to England, I got an owl from Dumbledore saying that he wished to see me about a possible position here at Hogwarts, and poof. Here I am. Katrina smiled and said, and I'm very glad you are. I know you'll keep an eye on Harry and his friends while I can't. Aaron said with a smile, you don't even have to ask. Just then, McGonagall came in, looking rather worn out, but it turned to shock as she asked Miss Belmont. What are you doing here? Katrina said, well, I wanted to see Harry to see how he was doing, and I ran into my friend. McGonagall said, oh, I see. Well, I just wanted to thank Miss Mystic for handling a situation earlier this evening. Katrina looked startled as she asked Aaron, did something happen? McGonagall sighed as she said, it seems our Mr. Potter has picked up on your tendencies to help others, even when it means risking his life. Katrina paled as she asked what happened. What? McGonagall put her hand on Katrina's shoulder as she said, not to worry, Miss Belmont, your friend here saved Harry, as well as his friends. Katrina sighed a breath of relief as she said, well, I did see him and his friends and they looked fine. McGonagall smiled as she said, it's good to see you, Miss Belmont, I will keep you updated on what's going on, I try to keep an eye on Harry as much as I can as well. Katrina smiled and said, thank you, Professor, good night. As the teacher left, she shot Aaron a look she knew all too well, she was in for it. She said, now look who didn't tell me about something. The next morning, Harry, Ron, Hermione and Mary had all gone outside for their second flying lesson, and just as they arrived, they noticed Malfoy floating above on his broom. He appeared to be dangling Trevor the Toad from above, while Neville had tears in his eyes as he said, gee, give him back. Please. Harry was infuriated at Malfoy that he grabbed a broom and before he even knew what he was doing, and ignoring Hermione and Mary's please don't do it, Harry, he floated to where Malfoy was and said firmly, give the Toad here, Malfoy.